The night my farm burned down, I thought losing my home would be the worst pain I would ever feel. But I was wrong, because the real heartbreak came the next morning when my own family looked at me like I no longer belonged anywhere. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 67 years old, and for more than 4 decades I lived on the same piece of land just outside a quiet farming town in Iowa. A place where the fields stretched wide under the sky and the wind carried the smell of hay and fresh soil every spring. That farm was never just property to me. My husband Robert and I built our life there, one board, one fence post, one stubborn dream at a time. We raised animals, planted corn, fixed broken tractors, and watched sunsets from the old wooden porch that creaked every time someone stepped on it. Even after Robert passed away 12 years ago, the farm still felt full of his presence. Every corner held a memory, every tree had a story, and every morning I woke up grateful that the life we worked so hard for was still standing. But one windy evening in early October, everything changed. I remember standing outside wrapped in my old brown coat while distant lights flickered against the dark sky beyond my fields. At first I thought it was just a neighbor driving down the road, but then the smell reached me, thick and sharp in the air, and when I turned back toward the barn I saw a glow where there should have only been darkness. The fire department arrived quickly, and they did everything they could, but by the time the sun rose the next morning, the farm I had known for 40 years was nothing more than smoke drifting above quiet ashes. I sat on the tailgate of a dusty pickup truck as the cool Iowa morning settled around me, holding a paper cup of coffee someone had handed me, staring across the land that had once been my entire world. I told myself that things could still be okay, that families help each other when life falls apart, and that all I needed was a little time and a little kindness until I could figure out what came next. So later that morning I picked up my phone and called my son Daniel. I expected concern, maybe even comfort, because that is what family is supposed to give you when everything else is gone. Instead, what I heard in the hours that followed would make me realize that losing my farm was only the beginning of what I was about to lose. I could still smell the smoke in my coat when I finally drove away from the farm that morning, and the road toward town felt longer than it ever had before. Daniel lived about 20 miles away in a newer neighborhood on the edge of Des Moines, the kind with wide sidewalks, identical mailboxes, and freshly planted trees that had not yet grown tall enough to cast real shade. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old pickup truck and telling myself that everything would work out once I saw my son. Daniel had always been a good boy when he was younger. He used to run through the cornfields with his dog and come back to the house with mud on his boots and a grin on his face. Robert used to say that Daniel would always look out for me when we got older. That promise echoed in my mind as I pulled into the driveway of his 2-story house just after noon. The place looked quiet and tidy, with a basketball hoop above the garage and a small American flag hanging beside the front door. I sat in the truck for a moment before getting out, because suddenly I felt nervous in a way that did not make sense. This was my son's home after all. When I knocked on the door, Daniel answered quickly, and for a brief second I saw genuine surprise on his face. "Mom, what happened to you?" he asked, looking at the dust on my coat and the tired look in my eyes. I explained everything as calmly as I could. I told him about the fire, about how the barn and most of the house were gone, and about how the insurance company would need time to review the claim before anything could be rebuilt. Daniel listened quietly, nodding a few times while rubbing the back of his neck. After a moment he stepped aside and let me come in. The living room smelled faintly like fresh paint and lemon cleaner, very different from the familiar scent of wood and soil that filled my old farmhouse. I had barely sat down on the couch when Jessica walked in from the kitchen. My daughter-in-law had always been polite in a distant sort of way, the kind of politeness that feels more like a formality than real warmth. She glanced at me, then at Daniel, and asked what was going on. Daniel explained the situation in a few short sentences, and while he spoke I watched Jessica's expression carefully. There was no anger there and no sympathy either, just a tight, thoughtful look as if she were calculating something. She folded her arms and leaned lightly against the kitchen counter before speaking. "That is terrible news," she said slowly. "But what exactly are you planning to do now?" I told her honestly that I had not figured everything out yet, and that I just needed a little time until the insurance company sorted things out. I assumed Daniel would immediately say that I could stay with them for a while. Instead, the room grew strangely quiet, and I noticed Daniel glance toward Jessica before answering. That was the moment when a small uneasy feeling settled in my chest, because for the first time in my life I realized my son was not the one deciding what happened next. I sat quietly on the couch while Daniel and Jessica exchanged a look that lasted only a second but somehow said more than a long conversation ever could. Daniel cleared his throat and lowered himself into the armchair across from me, while Jessica remained standing near the kitchen counter with her arms folded. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator from the other room, and the distant sound of a lawn-mower somewhere down the street. Finally Daniel spoke, but his voice carried a hesitation that made my stomach tighten. He said that the situation was complicated, and that their house was already very full with their schedules and responsibilities. Jessica nodded slightly as if encouraging him to continue. I tried to keep my expression calm because I still believed this conversation would end with Daniel saying that of course his mother could stay for a little while. After all, I had spent nearly 30 years making sure he always had a place to come home to. Instead, Jessica stepped forward and spoke before Daniel could say anything else. Her tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice someone uses when explaining a rule that will not be changed. She said that she felt terrible about what had happened to the farm, but that their home simply was not set up for another person to live there long term. She explained that the guest room had been turned into Daniel's office, and that their routines were already very busy. I told her I did not need much space, and that I only needed a little time until the insurance process moved forward. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Jessica looked at me with a small careful smile that did not reach her eyes. She said something that I will never forget. She said that unexpected situations happen to people all the time, and that there are many temporary housing options available in the city. Then she gently suggested that I might want to look into short-term rentals or community housing programs until I could figure out my next step. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood her words. The idea that my own family was suggesting I find some kind of shelter instead of staying with them felt unreal. I looked at Daniel, hoping he would interrupt and say that his mother was welcome in his home no matter what. Instead he rubbed his hands together and said quietly that Jessica had a point about space and timing. In that moment something inside my chest felt very heavy. I was not angry and I was not shouting. I was simply sitting there realizing that the house my son lived in did not include a place for me. Jessica then used a word that made the entire situation painfully clear. She said that while they cared about me, they could not take responsibility for someone who was suddenly, as she put it, essentially homeless. Hearing that word spoken so calmly in my son's living room made the air feel colder around me, and as I sat there looking at the polished floors and neat furniture I began to understand that losing my farm had also changed the way my own family saw me. I sat there for a few more seconds after Jessica said that word, homeless, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced that morning. I had never imagined that a single word could make a person feel like a stranger inside their own family. I looked over at Daniel again, waiting for him to say something that would soften the moment, something that would remind me that I was still his mother, and not just a problem that had appeared at his doorstep. Instead he leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and spoke in a careful voice, explaining that they were simply trying to be realistic about the situation. He said that their house was already busy and that Jessica worked from home most days, which meant the extra room was needed as an office. I nodded slowly even though part of me wanted to ask a simple question that stayed trapped inside my chest. For 30 years there had always been space for Daniel in my home, no matter what was happening in our lives. When he was young and broke after college he had lived in the farmhouse for almost a year while he figured out his career. When he married Jessica we hosted their wedding reception right in the field behind the barn because they said it would save money. The farmhouse had always been open to them, but now as I sat on their living room couch I realized the door was quietly closing in front of me. Jessica began speaking again, her voice calm and organized as if she had already thought through every detail of the conversation before I arrived. She mentioned that the city had several extended stay hotels and community housing programs designed for people who suddenly lost their homes. She even suggested that I could speak with the insurance company about temporary housing coverage while the claim was being processed. I listened politely because that is how I was raised. My parents taught me that dignity is something you carry with you, even when life becomes uncomfortable. Still, hearing my daughter-in-law calmly recommend shelters and short-term housing while I sat only a few feet away felt like watching my life being quietly moved aside. Daniel eventually stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the neat street where children were riding bicycles under the afternoon sun. He said he was sorry that things had turned out this way and that he hoped I understood they were only trying to keep their household stable. I told him that I understood, even though the words tasted strange in my mouth. After a few minutes, I slowly stood up from the couch and picked up my purse. Jessica walked me to the front door with the same polite smile she had worn since I arrived. Daniel followed behind us, but he did not say much more. When I stepped outside onto the driveway, the air felt cooler than before, and the quiet neighborhood looked almost too perfect, as if nothing difficult ever happened there. I climbed back into my old pickup truck and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. Just a few hours earlier, I had believed that losing my farm was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now, as I started the engine and pulled away from my son's house, I realized something even harder was settling into my heart, because for the first time in 67 years, I truly did not know where I belonged. I drove for nearly an hour without really thinking about where I was going. The familiar highways outside Des Moines stretched quietly in front of me while the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, turning the fields a soft golden color that reminded me of harvest season back on the farm. Normally that view would have comforted me, but that day it only made the silence inside the truck feel heavier. My phone sat on the passenger seat beside my purse, and several times I glanced at it, wondering who I could possibly call. Most of my old neighbors lived miles away near the farm, and many of my closest friends had moved to different states over the years to be closer to their own children. For a long moment I even considered calling the insurance company again, but I already knew they would repeat the same answer they had given earlier that morning, explaining that the claim review process would take time. Eventually I turned the truck onto a smaller country road and found myself heading back toward the land where my life had been for more than 40 years. The fire trucks were gone by then, and the road leading to the farmhouse looked strangely empty without the usual activity of tractors and delivery trucks passing by. When I pulled onto the gravel driveway, the quiet was almost unsettling. The farmhouse was no longer standing the way it once had, but the wide fields were still there, stretching across more than 80 acres of land Robert and I had worked so hard to maintain. I stepped out of the truck and walked slowly across the yard, careful with each step as the cool wind moved gently through the open space. There were still a few things scattered around the property that the fire had not touched. Near the edge of the yard stood the old oak tree where Robert had once hung a tire swing for Daniel when he was a boy. Seeing it standing there brought back a flood of memories so vivid that for a moment I could almost hear Daniel laughing as he ran across the grass with our old dog chasing behind him. I kept walking until I reached what used to be the front porch. Most of the wooden boards were gone now, but the stone steps were still there. I sat down slowly and looked across the land that had been my entire world for decades. The sky was turning shades of orange and pink as evening approached, and the wind carried the faint scent of smoke mixed with the familiar smell of soil. It was there, sitting quietly on those old steps, that I noticed something half buried near the edge of the porch foundation. At first I thought it was just another piece of debris, but when I brushed the dust away I realized it was a small framed photograph that must have fallen from one of the shelves inside the house. The glass was cracked, but the picture inside was still clear enough to recognize. It showed a much younger version of me standing beside a little boy with bright eyes and messy brown hair. I stared at that photograph for a long moment before the memory returned all at once, because that boy had once spent many afternoons running through this very yard while I watched over him. His name was Ethan Caldwell, and many years ago, before life carried him somewhere far beyond our quiet town, I had been the one who looked after him when his parents were too busy to be home. I sat on the old stone steps holding that photograph while the evening sky slowly darkened above the fields, and for the first time that entire day my mind drifted somewhere other than the fire and the painful conversation at Daniel's house. The boy in the picture could not have been older than 8 or 9, standing beside me with a crooked smile and a baseball cap that was much too large for his head. I remembered that hat clearly because he used to insist on wearing it everywhere, even when it slipped down over his eyes while he ran through the yard. Ethan Caldwell had not been related to me by blood, but for several summers he had been part of the daily rhythm of life on the farm. His parents owned a large manufacturing company in the city, and they had purchased a vacation property not far from our land many years ago. They were kind people, but they traveled constantly for business, which meant Ethan spent long afternoons at our farmhouse while they worked. I used to make him grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen and send him outside to play with Daniel among the cornfields and the old barn. Robert would laugh whenever the two boys came running back into the house covered in dirt and grass, and he always said the farm was a better playground than anything money could build. Ethan had been curious about everything back then. He would follow Robert around asking questions about tractors, crops, and how fences were repaired. Sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table while I baked pies and ask if he could help stir the batter. Those memories came back so clearly that it almost felt like stepping into another lifetime. Eventually, Ethan's family moved away when he was a teenager. And as the years passed, we lost contact the way people often do when life becomes busy and distances grow longer. I knew he had gone on to attend a prestigious university because his mother had sent a holiday card once mentioning it, but after that the updates stopped. The photograph in my hands must have been taken during one of those summers when the boys were still young enough to spend entire days exploring the fields without worrying about the future. I turned the frame over and noticed a small piece of tape still clinging to the back, holding a faded note written in careful handwriting. It was Ethan's mother's writing, thanking me for looking after her son during one particularly busy summer. Seeing that message stirred something inside me that I had not felt since the morning began. It was a reminder that long before the world became complicated, simple kindness had once connected people in ways that lasted far longer than anyone expected. I sat there thinking about that for several minutes while the cool evening breeze moved through the empty yard. Then a quiet thought entered my mind, almost hesitantly at first, because it had been many years since I last heard Ethan's name spoken aloud. I realized that somewhere out in the world that curious little boy had grown into an adult with a life of his own, and if the stories I had occasionally heard through old neighbors were true, he had become a very successful man. I reached into my purse and picked up my phone, staring at the screen for a long moment while I wondered whether calling someone from so far in the past was foolish, or simply the only small chance left in front of me. I held the phone in my hand while the sky slowly turned darker above the quiet fields, and I cannot explain exactly why pressing a single number suddenly felt so difficult. Perhaps it was because too many years had passed, or perhaps it was because asking for help from someone who had once been a child under my care felt strange in a way I could not quite describe. The name Ethan Caldwell had not been part of my daily life for decades. Yet the memory of that curious boy running through the tall grass on warm summer afternoons was still clear in my mind. I turned the photograph over again, looking at the faded note from his mother as if it might somehow guide my decision. The truth was that I did not even know if the phone number I remembered would still belong to him. People change numbers, move cities, build new lives, and sometimes the past simply fades away without leaving a way back. For several minutes I simply sat there on the old steps, listening to the quiet wind move through the empty land where the farmhouse had once stood. The farm had been my entire world for so many years that imagining life somewhere else felt almost impossible. Yet, the conversation with Daniel and Jessica earlier that day had made one thing painfully clear. I could not depend on my own family to help me find my footing again. That realization was not spoken with anger in my mind, only with a quiet sadness that settled deeper the longer I thought about it. Finally, I unlocked my phone and began searching through my old contacts. Most of the names there belonged to neighbors, church friends, or local businesses that had been part of farm life for years. I scrolled slowly until I reached a number saved long ago under a simple name that had not been touched in decades. Ethan. I had written it down years earlier when his parents first moved away, promising that we would stay in touch. Life had a way of interrupting those promises, but somehow the number had remained in my phone all this time like a forgotten bookmark from another chapter of my life. My thumb hovered above the screen for a long moment while doubts filled my mind. What if he did not remember me at all? What if he had grown into the kind of successful man who no longer had time for memories from a small Iowa farm? I almost locked the phone again and slipped it back into my purse, telling myself it was better not to disturb someone who had surely moved far beyond the quiet life I once knew. But then another thought came to me just as the last light of the sunset faded over the fields. Many years ago when Ethan was just a boy, he had once told me something while we were sitting at the kitchen table eating apple pie. He said that when he grew up and became successful, he would always remember the people who had been kind to him when he was small. I do not know why that simple memory suddenly felt important again, but it gave me just enough courage to take a slow breath and press the call button. The phone began to ring softly in the quiet evening air while I waited, not knowing whether the voice on the other end would recognize the woman who had once watched over him in a farmhouse that no longer existed. The phone rang long enough that I began to wonder if the number had changed after all, and, for a moment I almost ended the call because the quiet around me made every second feel longer than it really was. Then suddenly the ringing stopped and a calm male voice answered on the other end. He spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from years of responsibility, the voice of someone used to running meetings and making decisions that affect many people. He simply said hello and asked who was calling. My heart beat a little faster because for a brief moment I was not certain how to begin after so many years. I introduced myself slowly, saying that my name was Margaret Whitmore, and that many years ago I had lived on a farm outside a small town in Iowa. There was a short pause on the line, the kind of silence where you can almost hear someone thinking. I wondered if he was trying to remember or if he was already reaching for the polite words people use when they do not recognize a name from the past. Then something unexpected happened. His voice changed completely, the calm professional tone replaced by genuine surprise. He asked if I meant the same Margaret Whitmore who used to make grilled cheese sandwiches in a farmhouse kitchen and let two boys run through the cornfields all afternoon. Hearing those words brought an unexpected warmth to my chest, because it meant he remembered far more than I had dared to hope. I laughed softly and told him that yes, I was that Margaret. For a moment neither of us spoke because the years between then and now seemed to hang quietly in the space between our words. Ethan was the first to speak again, and there was a kindness in his voice that I had not felt from anyone that entire day. He said he had often wondered what had happened to the old farm, and that some of his happiest childhood memories had taken place there. He told me that when his parents moved away he had missed those summers more than anyone realized. I listened while he spoke, still sitting on the old stone steps as the evening air grew cooler around me. Eventually he asked gently what had made me call after all this time. I hesitated because I had not planned exactly how to explain the situation. Pride is a difficult thing to set aside, especially after spending a lifetime solving your own problems without asking anyone else for help. But something about Ethan's voice made it easier to be honest. I told him about the fire that had destroyed the farmhouse and the barns. I explained that the insurance process would take time, and that suddenly I found myself without a place to stay while everything was being sorted out. I did not mention the conversation with Daniel and Jessica in detail because speaking badly about family has never been something I am comfortable doing. When I finished explaining, the line became quiet again, but this silence felt different from the earlier one. It felt thoughtful rather than uncertain. Finally Ethan spoke again, and his voice carried the same warm certainty I remembered from the curious boy who once followed Robert around the farm asking endless questions. He said something that made me sit up a little straighter on those old stone steps. He said that the woman who had looked after him during those summers was never someone he could forget, and that if life had brought me to call him now, then perhaps it was time for him to return a kindness that had meant more to him than I ever realized. For several seconds after Ethan finished speaking, I simply sat there listening to the quiet evening wind moving across the empty fields, trying to absorb the unexpected kindness in his words. That entire day had been filled with moments that made the world feel colder and smaller, yet hearing the familiar warmth in his voice felt like a small light appearing in the distance. I told him that he did not need to feel any obligation to help me, and that I had only called because his number happened to still be saved in my phone after all those years. Ethan gently interrupted me before I could continue, and there was a quiet certainty in his tone that reminded me of the determined boy who once insisted on helping Robert repair a broken fence even though the tools were nearly as large as his hands. He said that some debts in life are not about money or favors, but about remembering who stood beside you when you were young, and still learning what kindness looked like. He told me that the summers he spent on our farm had shaped more of his childhood than anyone probably realized, and that the lessons Robert shared with him about work and responsibility had stayed with him long after his family moved away. I listened carefully while he spoke because something about his words carried a sincerity that is difficult to fake. Then he asked me where I was at that moment. I explained that I was sitting on the stone steps where my farmhouse porch used to be, and that the fields around me were quiet now that the fire crews had gone. Ethan paused again, and when he spoke his voice sounded thoughtful, almost as if he were already planning something in his mind. He said that he happened to be in Chicago that week for business, but that he would be flying to Iowa the following morning for a meeting with one of his companies that operated not far from Des Moines. Hearing that surprised me because the world suddenly felt much smaller than it had only a few hours earlier. Ethan then said something that made me straighten my shoulders even though he could not see me. He told me that if I did not mind waiting until the next afternoon, he would drive out to the farm himself because there were some things he would like to see again after so many years. I tried to protest politely, explaining that he must be an extremely busy man now, and that he should not rearrange his schedule just to visit an old piece of land. Ethan laughed softly in a way that sounded very familiar, and he replied that sometimes the most important appointments in life are the ones we choose to make ourselves. Before we ended the call, he asked me to promise that I would stay somewhere safe for the night, and that we would speak again in the morning once he arrived in Iowa. When the call finally ended, I remained sitting there on the steps for a long moment holding the quiet phone in my hand. The farm was still silent and the future was still uncertain. But for the first time since the fire began that morning, I no longer felt completely alone on that empty piece of land.